Hey guys, it's Nick. Hope you guys enjoy this. This is my second of two Mayday projects for Voltairine de Cleyre. Nowhere near perfect at any of this stuff, but anyway. The Gates of Freedom. Footnote. See pages 96 to 102. Source, Lucifer, 8:35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41. April 10th, 17th, 24th, May 8th, 15th, 22nd, 29th, 1891. Labadie Collection, University of Michigan Library. This address was delivered before the Liberal Convention at Topeka, Kansas, March 15, 1891, and is being read from Gates of Freedom, Voltairine de Cleyre and the Revolution of the Mind, with selections from her writings, by Eugenia C. Delamont. They have rights who dare maintain them. This is my text. And the purpose of my lecture is threefold. First, to state the facts concerning the actual sick status of woman in relation to society as a whole, what position she really holds in human economy. Not, mind you, what classes of men regard her, not how, quote, she is considered by the law, not what she imagines herself, but the bald fact of what she is. Second, to show upon what ground we demand certain, quote, rights in protest against conditions, which, however necessary they may have been in the past evolution of the race, no longer satisfy the demands of a higher civilization. And lastly, to point out the gates through which woman must pass to freedom. What then is woman? Property, since the days when Proudhon uttered his famous sentence, property is robbery. Footnote, see Part 1, Chapter 1 for de Cleyre's debts to pure Joseph Proudhon, 1809-65, especially her metaphors of theft. The word has had an ugly sound in the ears of those who aim to realize the ideal glory of humanity, and I have no doubt that there are those among you, men, whose hearts have outgrown your heads, whose aspirations rise higher than your inheritances, who clothe hard facts with sentimental fancies, as ivy clothes the ruin. Some of you will feel outraged at me that I should declare this ugly actuality, that woman is property. But facts are facts and stubborn things, and it is better to face a fact staring it in the teeth than to shield your eyes until you run against it unaware. Certainly there is no one to whom this truth is more unpalatable than to me, a woman. I remember well the lingering indignation that I felt when I read in the first issue of a scientific quarterly, The Monist, an article on, quote, the material relations of sex, by no less a person than the noticed evolutionist, Professor E.D. Cope, proving the existence of property women beyond the possibility of cavil, and what was worse, held up this condition of hers as an ideal in perpetuity, to cease following after which was for the race to virtually commit suicide. It is very aggravating, though perhaps I had better not admit it, or the Cope's sick will sneer, quote, emotional sensibility to be aggravated by a fact womanish. In other words, it is mildly annoying, after one has successfully disposed of a mumbling theologian or an awful doctor of laws, to then have a scientific man appear on the scene, and, with all the dispassionate gravity of intellect, proceed to prove that the theologian and the lawyer were right. The worst is, that while priest and lawyer draw their arguments from faith and prejudice, the scientist always backs his up with facts. This was what most chagrined me in the article to which I refer. There is no denying Professor Cope's facts, the only thing what is left to dispute his conclusions. What then are those facts? Learn, O you mothers, for what and to and what you are, bring your daughters to the world, educating them to adorn themselves with all the graces of a person of intellect and of morals, and learn what position it is you yourself hold in this world, which never tires of singing the glory of motherhood, says Professor Cope after speaking of the struggle of man against nature. Quote, woman considered by herself is subject to identical conditions. Her needs are the same, and her environments the same, but she is not well so endowed as man to supply the one or to meet the other. Her disabilities are of two kinds, physical and mental. The physical are, first, inferior muscular strength, and secondly, childbearing. The latter means more or less incompetence for active work at monthly periods or several months of gestation and lactation, and some years' care of children. The mental disabilities are, first, inferior power of mental coordination, and secondly, greater emotional sensibility, which more or less interferes with rational action. End quote. After expatiating upon her resolute inability to cope with man in the competitive struggle for existence, to which expatiations I shall refer later on, he proceeds, quote, but nature has supplied a most effective remedy. Woman, not being of the same sex as man, supplies a necessity which is almost universal, so that she is placed, if she exercise reasonable care, in a position better than that of man in relation to the struggle for existence. The antagonist of man, his fellow man, is eliminated from the list of antagonists of woman, and that is an advantage which cannot be overestimated. Not only is man removed from the field, but he becomes an active helper in resisting the forces of nature. More than this, he is willing, under the circumstances, to divide with her what he extracts from both man and nature. Were these the only benefits which woman derives from man, they would constitute a sufficient reason for the usual preference she displays for his protection, rather than a life of independence. But she is herself possessed of a sex interest, which is satisfied by such a relation. Not only this, but our love of children constitutes a further inducement which is highly effective in bringing about her customary relations with man. Ellipses and original. Quote, the support and protection given to woman by man is then the clearly rendered as an equivalent, for the services that she renders him. Notation. Typos in the original render this as, soar the services she renderee him. In the capacity of a wife. It is universally implied, if not distinctly stated in the contract between them, that she shall not be the wife of some other man, and that the children she bears shall be those of the male party to the contract. End quote. Emphasis mine. I wish that every word of these two sentences might plow deep furrows where they fall upon your women's hearts. I wish you to understand clearly their full significance, realizing what this scientist means by, quote, your services as a wife. He has so worded his sentences as to leave no doubt that the marriage contract is an agreement of man to protect and support woman in return for the gratification of his sexual appetite, and the bearing of children for him, not for her. What is it then to occupy this position, this enviable position, if we are to credit Professor Cope, in which the, quote, antagonist of man, his fellow man, is eliminated, end quote, this honorable position of wife, to which the wise editors of the silly correspondence columns of society journals continually point young girls as the grand desideratum of courtship? What is to be a woman? To be property. To be sure, you are a little higher kind of property than the rest of man's effects. The chattel slave was a little higher kind of property than the planter's horse. You supply a somewhat more, quote, universal need than carriage driving or even corn planting. Hence, you are somewhat dearer property. Nevertheless, you are treated upon exactly the same basis as the rest of man's livestock. You are housed, fed, clothed, quote, protected, loved, for even men even pat their dog's head at sometimes. In return for what? The superintendence of man's home and the definite paternity, care, and education of man's children. Young girls, if any one of you is contemplating marriage, remember that that is what the contract means. The sale of the control of your person in return for, quote, protection and support. The sad part of it is the majority of women think it is all right. I've heard from the lips of young girls who, unwittingly the meaning of their own words, talked earnestly of disposing of themselves to the individual most likely to house and clothe and protect them best. I have heard well-educated, bright, intelligent girls express themselves complacently concerning the fact that they were of no earthly use in the world, save to adorn the display counters of the matrimonial market, where he who comes to purchase might choose them. And I have turned away in disgust that they could be content to thus sacrifice their individuality to, as Professor Cope says, display, quote, her usual preference for man's protection rather than for a life of independence. Turn from them in a contempt only to go among the self-supporting working girls and find the same old sickening story. These regard with envy their idle sisters as occupying the true position of unmarried women, and they themselves look forward to the same ultimatum, the day when they will no longer compete in the struggle for independent livelihood, but be wedded and supported and protected and bear children for some man. Worse than this prattle of girls, I have heard it from the lips of young married women whose dream of love has changed to ashes in a few short months. I have heard them helplessly accept the burden, so much heavier than they had dreamed, and despairingly say, quote, it is the lot of woman. I am housed, fed, clothed, and protected. It was for this I surrendered the control of myself, and if my husband wishes me to have children, I must bear them. End quote. Quote, ah, said one woman to me, a woman who, though married but 5 years, had already borne 3 children, it seems to me when my husband approaches me, notation, i.e. sexually, as if my heart would turn to stone, but I suppose I can do my duty by him. End quote. Her duty, saddest of all. I have heard from the lips of white-haired grandmothers who have gone down the cold winter of women's sacrificial existence, the same old lie gone that the burden of indignity and misery and the very martyrdom which man puts upon this chattel, which he houses, clothes, feeds, and protects, is inevitable, and there is nothing for her to do but bear it patiently. It is needless to repeat the justifications, the flimsy tinselling with which men cover up the facts concerning women's position in relation to themselves. Even Professor Cope degrades the intellect of his readers by assuring them that it is a much to be coveted position, after distinctly proving property in women. When those individuals who wish to protect women have dressed the truth in draperous adjectives of superlative falsity, such as, quote, too high, too pure, too ethereal, too angelic, end quote, etc., ad nauseum, it is to one who looks with clear eyes at this diaphanous vision which they would have believed the image of ourselves, far too much like a stage angel rising, not upon wings, but upon a trap. Footnote, i.e., a trap door that brings the angel up to the stage door, but the word is, of course, also a pun here. I say right here, candidly, that as a class, I have nothing to hope from men. Author's note, I've been criticized for this remark as, quote, too sweeping. I said then and I say now, as a class. No tyrant ever renounced his tyranny until he had to. If history teaches us anything, it teaches this. Therefore, my hope lies in creating rebellion in the breasts of women. And when I am discouraged, it is never because of the attitude of men, since that is always to be counted upon, but because of the apathy, the passivity, the can't-help-itness, or the religious slavishness of my own sex. I say religious slavishness because, with a very large percentage of women, the idea of her, quote, lawful subjection to man is a profoundly religious conviction. The result of a supine theological deduction, strong along through the scriptures from Genesis to the epistles, beginning said, quote, unto the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrows and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. End quote. And concluding with, quote, let the woman learn in silence with due submission, for the man is the head of the woman, even as Christ is the head of the church. It is true that the major portion of Christian women who believe the Bible but don't read it know very little of those sentences. Either they have never heard of them, or, having heard, have simply lent to their reading the mechanical service of their ears, letting the sounds slide out as they slid in. Nevertheless, this curse is ascribed to Jehovah, and this command recorded by Paul, sank deep into woman ages ago, deep into her unconscious nature, that part of which her lies below the domain of intellect, but which in its dark, unknown soil ripens the germs of all her actions. Footnote. Theories of the unconscious were in circulation in psychological discourse, but de Cleyre's use of the term most often refers to evolutionary psychology. Submission has become part of a woman's moral instinct. It is a characteristic of woman. That's what she believes, she lives, it becomes her. In this way, the opinions of Messrs, the gods, footnote, Monsieurs les name, polite form of reference in French, but for humans, not gods, in which case it would be ostensibly reverend. De Cleyre, who believes in no god or gods anyway, thus uses it with double sarcasm. Sanctified by much prayer, burning of tapers and smoking of incense, have made the ideal of wifehood uncomplaining slavery. Now why should it be otherwise? If the law sanctions and religious sanctifies, and our ancestors were satisfied, and a large portion of humanity is still satisfied with this condition of affairs, why do we complain? This brings us to the second consideration, viz., upon what grounds is our protest offered? And in answering the question, I appeal from Professor Cope to sociology. Footnote. A new science in the late 19th century associated with Darwinism, new conceptions of the term, quote, social, and a new focus on the possibility of scientifically improving, quote, society, also a new inflected word. See Riley, Chapter 3. Subsequent references to, quote, the pack mule stage of development and humanity's natural, quote, upward course, i.e. upward evolutionary course, reflects popular misconceptions that Darwinian evolution implied progress. Cope was a theorist of evolution, although Lamarckian. Hence, perhaps her choice of evolutionary theory is a way of hosting him on his own petard. Now, the first decision of sociology is that the very fact that a question is being agitated, the very fact that any considerable number of individuals, members of a class, or race, or sex, are, in popular vernacular, quote, kicking about something, protesting against class, or race, or sex condition, is proof that the time for change is ripening. It is proof that this special form of social growth is no longer adapted to the environment, that through many throes of death and birth, the old idea of justice is dying, and the new is being born. All progress is marked by this transition, from content to discontent, from satisfaction to pain, that is to say, from unconsciousness to consciousness. Now, justice is progressive. It does not follow that justice of one age is justice of the next. On the contrary, the burden which our ancestors bore in no wise fits our shoulders, if that is not to say that it did not fit theirs. Footnote. In no way. If humanity, in its upward course, must need pass through the pack mule stage of development, that is no reason to curse it on the one hand, nor insist that the race shall continue as pack mules on the other. I insist on this point of the progressiveness of justice, first because I do not wish you to think of me as a metaphysical dreamer, holding the exploded theory that, quote, rights are positive, unalterable, indefinable things passed down from one generation to another after a fashion of an entailed estate. Footnote. A late 19th century audience would recognize the reference to entailed estates, typically a way of protecting a male line of descent, as a subtle joke of the assumption in most natural rights theories that the heir of these natural, quote, rights is by default men, and come into existence in some mysterious manner at the exact moment that humanity emerges from apedom. It would be quite too difficult a matter to settle on the emerging point. I insist on the progressiveness of justice because, however fierce my denunciation of injustice may be, I nonetheless recognize it to have have been the justice of the past, the highest possible condition so long as the aspirations of the general mind rose no farther, a part of invincible necessity. And last, I need the admission of the progressiveness of justice in order to explain my text and prove my assertion that, however necessary the slavery of women may have been, it is no longer in accord with the ideals of our present civilization. In what consists the progress of justice? Sociology. Footnote. The new social science, a term that implied not merely study of science, but study with a view to improvement. Putting its finger upon the movements of man in the past, viewing him in all the various stages of his social development, as a naturalist examines the purifications of rocks and traces back the lineage of countries' flora or fauna, deduces from it carefully guided from this fact from this conclusion. Social progress consists in a constantly widening sphere of activity to individuals and, of necessity, a corresponding diminution of the power of one individual or set of individuals over others. That is, sociology confirms what 93, footnote, Revolutionary France in 1793, proclaimed. Science applauds the red flag, footnote, a symbol of the Paris Commune of 1871, a short-lived revolution with anarchist characteristics. See Introduction to Section 2. And carries as its banner the motto of the Commune, liberty, equality, fraternity. Gradually, one after another, various forms of slavery, such as feudalism, chattelism, monarchism, have disappeared or are disappearing. Between you and me, I think republicanism is going along with them. Gradually, destiny, God, law, adaptation, whatever you choose to call this glorious fact, has, quote, put down the mighty fact from their seat and exalted them of low degree, end quote. Footnote, Luke 1:52. Yet, through it all, every inch of the ground has been disputed, and not one iota yield up until those upon whom had come the vision of greater liberty, a foray taste of, quote, rights, had, quote, dared maintain them, and through a great struggle risen to the dignity of a higher order of existence. It is in contemplating this struggle that we, who cry for the abolition of women's slavery, receive our inspiration. It is in remembering that always before the coming of a, quote, new dispensation, voices must cry in the wilderness, birds beat broken wings before the storm, that we take up our task, certain that where we lead or are driven, quote, by the might of the inward must, footnote, from a poem by Gerald Massey, see Chapter 3. Others will follow. It is in realizing the vastness of humanity, the sublimity of the new ideal, the insignificance of, quote, self, that we forget pain in our endeavor to arouse the slumbering soul, that it may conceive its rights and dare maintain them. But to the application of the deduction of sociology, we say, if social progress consists in a constantly tendency towards the equalization of liberties of the social units, then the demands of progress are not satisfied so long as half society, woman, is in subjection. If men are enjoying all their, quote, their own, quote, rights, and some of ours as well, that is not equality, that is privilege and spoliation. That is to say, the old conception of justice must give place to a new one, because woman, through her dimly roused consciousness, is beginning to feel her servitude, that there is a requisite acknowledgment to be won from her master before he is put down and she is exalted to equality. This acknowledgment is the freedom to control her own person. You can have no free or just or equal society, nor anything approaching it, so long as womanhood is bought, sold, housed, clothed, fed, and protected as a chattel. We upon whom the great light has dawned, footnote, undoubtedly a reference to the, quote, grey dawn at the tragic climax of Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, see Chapter 3, whose perceptions are no longer locked in the dull sleep of base content. We point you to our weary sisters who week after week, month after month, till years have dragged away, rise early in the morning to go through the discouraging round of petty duties which might be done just so often, every day and all day long, often borrowing from the night the hours of sleep that she may finish some little thing, the value of which we will never know, never even be counted, less than a cipher. We point you to her sitting tonight, perhaps, with folded hands at last, sitting alone by the firelight, after the long harassing day of little tortures that wear the soul, as pinpoints gingerly pressed against the flesh wear the body, trying to the silence to learn, not from her husband, he's at the lodge, but from her own poor unknown soul, this helpless chrysalis which faintly stirs within her, trying to learn if this is a fair bargain, a just thing, a righteous thing, trying to learn if that she should give the labor of her hands all these years, continually put in the background all her desires, and wait, till from long denial aspiration dies, and she is left an uncomplaining clod of clay, vested with the awful patience of despair. Sitting there in the light of the fire, looking forward to the utterly desolation of spirit, which is creeping upon her as surely as time is creeping upon eternity, looking forward to the time when her husband shall have grown so far beyond her intellectually that he will pity her, good God, pity her, at the same time that her company is irksome to him because of her, quote, inferior powers of mental coordination, sitting there in her dumb sorrow, bleeding to death inwardly, silently asking herself, quote, is this justice? Is this equality? Perhaps then she remembers the small beds upstairs with their glowing, health-kissed sleepers. Perhaps a smile flits over her face as she dreams, followed by a spasm of reproach that she should even be by her sick. A thought, begrudge them the life, the strength they have taken from her, those beloved children. But after that comes the bitter remembrance. They are not my children, they are his. That too was a part of the contract, that I should bear children for him, care and educate them for him. It was what I do in return for food, clothing, shelter, and protection. They are not my children any more than the calf that men sell for veal belongs to the cow. After all, did she want them? When they were born, well, yes, she would not have them die, but before that, would she have chosen voluntarily to go through these years of martyrdom, even for them? So many and so close together that to no one could she give the care requisite to really develop its nature? Terrible question, and the pain that goes with it, quivering outward to the visible shudder till she shades her face from the firelight. The thought, quote, to which of them unconscious, sleeping, trusting, am I the traitor? To the first and second in cheating them of their higher training by dividing my care with the fifth or sixth, or the fifth and sixth in demeaning their existence a burden? Anyway, how could he decide what it was possible for me to do? How? And so the bitter reverie goes on, concluded no doubt by a self-accusing start when she hears her husband's hand upon the latch, and remembers that she has not put his slippers by the fire. We point you to this picture because it is not an extreme case. We do not show you the awful slavery of wifehood among the bitterly poor. We give no overdrawn example of a large family, no instance of horrible cruelty, such as would be easy to give, such as our divorce courts teem with, but which it is a penitentiary offense to discuss in plain terms in a liberal paper. We give only the pathetic facts of the ordinary woman's life, and we say the social contract between man and woman is unjust, unfair, unrighteous contract, a contract which does not square with the law of equal freedom. We say this is the reason why there should be a radical change in the present relations of the sexes, and this brings us to the discussion of what most properly comes under the title of this lecture, the gates of freedom. Clearly, if this contract, which stipulates that there shall be protection and support from man in return for childbearing, rearing, and nursing, and homemaking on the part of woman, if this contract is to be annulled and woman to become a free individual, then certainly she must be self-sustaining, that is to say, become an industrial competitor with man. But, says Professor Cope, it is self-evident that any system which looks to a career for woman independent of man, such as man pursues, is abnormal and injurious to her interest. For it is evident that were a woman of the same sex as man, that is, were she simply another kind of man, she would soon be eliminated from the earth under the operation of the ordinary law of the survival of the fittest. This need not be though any agencies different from those now actually in operation among men under the ordinary circumstances of trade, and such is often the actual history of male men who possess marked feminine characteristics. It does not follow from this that some women might not sustain themselves apart from men, in agriculture, trade, and the professions. This is especially possible where the struggle is not very severe, but in the cases which exist few are really independent of male assistance, which is furnished the capital either of cleared land or money or as an appointing power. The general result, as above stated, is self-evident from the facts. End quote. Italics mine. I know there is a large class of sentimental reformers who hope to, quote, enact universal harmony, repeal the law of centrifugal force, and make facts to suit theories, to whom the mention of the word competition is like, quote, flaunting a red flag, etc., and those whose comprehension of the woman question is about as deep as their understanding of socialism. I know these persons will be ready to supplant the position of Professor Cope with a scheme of state organization which they call cooperation, whose motto, instead of being equal liberty, is equal slavery, and one of whose intents is to make women dependent upon, quote, the state, instead of upon a husband. Their argument is very specious, but it runs like this. One of the most important and necessary services is rendered to the state by woman, viz. Race reproduction. Every mother, therefore, deserves the support and protection of the state. O tempora, o mores, footnote, O times, O manners, from Roman author Marcus Tullius Cicero. Proteus, footnote, in Roman mythology, son of the sea god Neptune, noted for his shape-changing ability. The allusion implies that in centralized versions of socialism, as opposed to anarchism, the husband, patriarchal protector of the wife he exploits, shapeshifts into the state, which plays the same role. Reappears, again to be protected and supported, and her children belong to whom? The state. With all due respect to the intentions of my sentimental friends, let me say that any scheme which proposes to pay women for being mothers is a degrading thing to her, and I care not whether it comes from Professor Cope or Edward Bellamy. Footnote, Edward Bellamy, 1850 to 1898, author of the widely read utopian novel Looking Backward, 2000, 1880 to 1887, which was published in 1888, which de Cleyre here criticizes for its centralized version of socialism. We have declared war, a few of us, and we accept no such treaty. We will be satisfied with nothing less than that maternity shall be put beyond the necessity of price, dependence. This means that we intend to be industrially independent, that we consider ourselves perfectly able to compete with men in a free field, and when our battle is won, as one it will be some day, though none of us will live to see it, the body of woman will be our own, and husbands must meet their wives on the proud footing of equality. But Professor Cope says that in that case we shall all die off the face of the earth under the operation of the law of the survival of the fittest. We are an inferior kind of beings who must necessarily go to the wall in the fierce competition for the means of existence. Our services would not be in demand, we should be continually out of work. How ill squares this portmanteau of the scientist with a laboring man's protest, quote, "The women are taking our places." Haven't you heard it? Haven't you heard how in the New England factories, one after another, the male weavers have disappeared and the, quote, "women have taken their places"? Haven't you heard how in the shoe factories of Philadelphia and New York and Boston shoe workers are out of employment because in the fierce competition for places, women have learned to work cheaper and live cheaper than men? I'm not defending the suicide of the giant labor, which takes place when the people combat each other for the chance to serve masters, but I'm taking Professor Cope on his own ground, and showing that even were this present horrible throttling of free competition by monopoly to go on, this, quote, "cutthroat competition of handicapped laborers, there is quite as much likelihood that, quote, men would die off the face of the earth as women." I have mentioned textile manufacturers and shoe makers. Add to this hatting, tailoring, shirt-making, glove-making, book-binding, thread manufacture, in which the number of women outnumber the men 3-to-1, and it would be easy to make the list longer. And you will perceive that in these cases, under the law of the survival of the fittest, men have been obliged to succumb. Do you tell me, quote, "man furnished to the capital"? Bless my soul, why don't you say that of the men whose places they took? No, man didn't furnish the capital, but certain individual men, by means of a masculinely instituted law, have stolen the capital which both men and women produced. I don't think we owe them any particular acknowledgment of inferiority on that account, unless perhaps an inferiority of rascality. Inferior? Yes, I am willing to admit that in certain things we are inferior to men. Also in certain things men are inferior to crocodiles. For instance, their teeth are not as long and savage, their mouths are hardly as spacious. The time was when the mastodon trode through geologic forests, kings of the earth, the fittest to survive. The forests are gone, the environment is altered, the mastodon has disappeared. In strength he was superior to man, but the demand for strength gave way before the development of the brain. The age of dominion of muscular force is past. In the language of Oliver Schreiner, the age of the domination of nervous force has cut the band of inevitable necessity with the knife of mechanical invention. It doesn't require a great body nor a powerful arm in order to engage in the productive labor of the day. No terrible amount of power is needed to press an electric button or turn a screw. I have seen most splendidly developed muscular Negro, footnote, the lowercase Negro is not in this period a sign of disrespect. The move to capitalize it came later. See Hornsby 135, Harley 236. The use of lowercase for Christianity, however, is surely intended as a sign of deliberate disrespect from an atheist in a free-thought newspaper. Breaking cobblestones at $1 per day, while a white-handed delicate girl was operating a typewriter at $1,000 a year. I do not pretend to say that these rewards were just, but that if you will instance muscular strength, I must show that the greatest rewards of your own economic system are not for muscular strength. Dexterity and skill are the requirements of the age. It is often urged as proof of woman's inferiority that she is not able to bear arms. I don't think any of us feel very bad about this. I think the majority of enlightened women regard war as barbarism, and the phrase, quote, "bearing arms," a sinister satire on modern Christianity. Nevertheless, if it comes to that gens, Grant and Sherman, footnote, Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union forces in the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman, Union general famous for his devastating march through Georgia, could have learned a lot from Sofia Pravorsky. Footnote: Sofia Pravorsky, member of the Russian revolutionary group Narodная Volya, which planned the 1881 assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Pravorsky was hanged. The dreadful science of modern warfare teaches that there too it is a skill, not numbers, not muscular strength, which counts. No longer the forced marches, the masses of foot and horse, the unwieldy movements of thousands or 100,000 of men. No, a single figure in the darkness, a flash, a blast, and the work of an army is done. Was the figure man or woman? Such is the progress of mechanics and chemistry, and with their further development we may look for a race of people constantly degenerating in muscles and strengthening in nervous power. So the first objection is invalid. The second is that woman labors under an irremediable physical disadvantage in that she must bear and train children. Regarding the periodical, quote, unfitness of women for active work, I hardly think it is worthwhile noticing. The thousands upon thousands of actively employed women toiling 10 hours a day, year in and year out, in our factories and shops disprove that. It is the exception, not the rule, that there is any discontinuance of work on that account. Regarding the bearing of children, while we may not have sufficient evidence to prove that it can ever be a purely painless affair, universally speaking, yet recent experience and sanitary science go to prove that a moderate amount of exertion during gestation is not only uninjurious, but rather beneficial, and by far the greater part of the suffering incident to maternity is due to ignorance, improper diet, improper dress, uncongenial surroundings, and sexual slavery to a husband. Yet withal, this physical disability, even as it is, need not prove the perpetual barrier to independence which Professor Cope would make of it. For in the future society, the future, even while we speak, is beginning to shape and glow among the mists that seethe up from the cauldron of change. In the future society, the price of independence, either for man or woman, will not be what it is today. In the future society, under the operation of the same inexorable law which scientists constantly invoke, the isolated home and its entire economy will have passed away. Division of labor and socialism will have entered the household. Not only will there be economy of time, labor, and adaptability, so far as washing, ironing, cooking, sweeping, dusting, sewing, patching, darning, and dishwashing is concerned, but it will also be learned that not every woman should give her energy to a species of hen with one chicken raising of a child because she happens to be its mother. It will be learned that while one woman may be a very good mother, it does not follow that she is a good nurse or a good teacher, or that there can be no greater curse to a child than to make it for granted that because a certain man and woman were its progenitors, that therefore it must submit to their method of nursing, training, and education, no matter how utterly incompetent they may be. I am a perfect rebel to this idea. I know that it is quite possible to love one's parents, even to revere them, and yet to be so thoroughly incompatible with them that both love and reverence may be worn out by the constant friction of tendency and repression. I believe that more children are ruined by their fathers and mothers' misunderstandings and general incapability than would be safe to enumerate, and I look forward to the time when the selfishness and the narrowness engendered by the individual home and individual training, the freaks of character born of this blundering of incongruous natures upon one another, as a day golden in the skies of children no less than the woman. What do I mean? The socialistic nursery, where women and men who succeed in reaching the natures of children, who recognize their task to be one worth learning well, making a specialty of all, not an addenda to some other's life work, will be employed as teachers are employed in colleges. No one today doubts that, for by far the largest portion of our children, the educational institution is a much more serviceable instrument than a private tutor. No one imagines any more than every mother should teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to her children. That work has gone into more competent hands. So it will be with the nursery. Is this shocking? Yes, it is true that I mean just this, an economy of mothers. It is true that I believe no more pitiable waste of life attends our present social system, the unnecessary and mischievous waste of child nurses. Anyhow, whether it is shocking or not, whether I advocate it or don't, this very thing is already growing up in your cities. I know of more than 50 cases where women have found it better to enter the lists of industrial competition and engage for their young babies the care of others by nature much better fitted for the task. And these cases I know from no special investigation on my part. They come under my notice in my daily life in a large city. Thus, socialism disposes of the physical bars to independence. We are now to consider the mental disabilities. These are, says Professor Cope, quote, first, inferior powers of mental coordination, and second, greater emotional sensibility, which more or less interferes with rational action, end quote. I admit these things, but given equal opportunity in the same environment which developed the present intellectual superiority of man will soon develop the intellectual equality of woman. We are inferior in these things because we haven't had the chance to be equal. See, my left hand is less dexterous than my right. Why? All my life long I've been doing most things with my right hand. I button shoes with the left. In that particular work, it is the more cunning of the two. So with men and women. Men are exceedingly awkward about those things to which they are not accustomed. So are we. But as the left hand may grow to do the same thing the right does, so too shall we learn as soon as the opportunity is free, and if we had time to adapt ourselves to conditions of self-dependence. Mind you, I never expect men to give us liberty. No, woman, we are not worth it until we take it. How shall we take it? By the ballot? A fillip for your paper rag. The ballot hasn't made men free, and it won't make us free. By advocating the destruction of any and every barrier, the abolition of every law whereby the sources of wealth are held out of use. In other words, by advocating the complete liberation of land and capital, by holding in view the ideal of a society so organized that 2 hours labor per day would be more than sufficient for the needs of the day. By insisting on a new code of ethics founded on the law of equal freedom, a code recognizing the complete individuality of women. By making rebels wherever we can, by ourselves living our beliefs, propaganda by the deed, notation. See Chapter 2 for the meaning of this complex term. It is the favorite expression of the revolutionists. We are revolutionaries. And we shall use propaganda by speech, deed, and most of all, life, being what we teach. My liberty is dearer to me than a slavery of silk. My individuality is worth all the opprobrious epithets, all the gall and wormwood it has ever cost to maintain it, and not because it is I, but because of the truth of which I live. O woman, when I think of all the ages you have waited, when I think how man has asked you of everything, every desire born of his selfishness, accepted of you every sacrifice, taken from you ruthlessly, eating your few dear hours of peace, as the rich who have appropriated all, strike from his hand the beggar's crust, for pastime, when I remember how he has studied and achieved at your expense while you trudge patiently to win time to him, till all your hopes lay white and still and stiff within your breast, when I remember the arid, barren, unchanging day that comes afterward, and then death in the desert. Footnote, reference to Schreiner's figure of the woman in the desert. See chapter 3. When I remember it all, and think of it all, it seems as if my heart has turned to tears, and they were frozen. And then in my dreams I see the figure of a giantess, a lonely figure out in the desolate prairie, with nothing over her but the grey sky, and no light upon her face but the chill pallor of the morning. And I see her looking upward and whispering, "How broad it is! It is cold and dark, and frowning, but it is broad and high." Such will be your figure, O woman, such your words in the day of your emancipation, in the day when you break from your cell, this warmed round cell, where horizon wall is your children's life, whose light is your husband's eyes, whose zenith is your husband's smile. Better the pitiless grey of the clouds than the white ceiling of a prison. Better the loneliness of the prairie than the caress of a slave-born child. Better the cold biting of the wind than a master's kiss. Better the war of freedom than the peace of slavery.